Great. Thank you so much, Peter, for that introduction. Thank you so much for the first panel, which was fantastic. I just want to quickly introduce the speakers, so from the far end to here. So starting with Raluca, who's the Executive Director of UiPath Foundation, a global nonprofit organization supporting underprivileged children from Romania and India to reach their potential through 21st century-oriented education. Raluca has almost 14 years of experience in designing and implementing innovative programs in vulnerable communities, linking education to technology, arts, sport, and community organizing with a particular focus on digital inclusion. Eleanor Sarpong is a skilled public policy, internet access, and digital inclusion global thought leader working at the intersection of internet, telecommunications, and development. With over 20 years in the corporate, public, and nonprofit sectors, Eleanor has led national ICT policy development and worked with over 15 countries. Anasuya Senguptan is co-director and co-founder of Whose Knowledge, a global multilingual campaign to center the knowledges of marginalized communities online. She's led initiatives across the global south and internationally for over 25 years to collectively create feminist presence and futures of love, justice, and liberation. She's a co-founder and advisor to Newman Fund, the first feminist tech fund for and from the global south, the former chief grant-making officer at the Wikimedia Foundation, and the former regional program director at the Global Fund for Women. Okay, so I noticed that, well, now that it's up on the board, today's topic, which we're talking about, is digital divides, which is a pretty big idea and a pretty big concept. So I want to start maybe by getting your impressions of what the digital divide means to you. What does it mean to your work? How does it influence what you do?
Mm-hmm. Hi everyone, and thank you for the invitation. It's a real privilege to be here in this panel with these incredibly inspiring women I had the chance to meet yesterday and talk about a topic that is of concern to all of us. And I think we can't actually talk about a digital divide without talking about inequality at large, because digital equity is not separated from society, is not separated from the social realities. It's not separated from economy. So we're looking right now at the concatenation from this perspective. So talking about digital divide entails talking about inequality at large. So my perspective is very much related to how we enable children from underprivileged communities to have access to quality education. And the pandemic has amplified inequality. At the same time, we've seen how technology can create amazing opportunities to address this divide. And I wanted to share with you a reflection about imagining and reimagining futures. I think in marginalized communities, and I've been working in such areas for almost 14 years, imagining your future is a privilege. Being connected to your potential from a perspective of digital opportunities, I mean, that's also a privilege. Just being aware and making the most of the opportunities that are around you. So I think we should be fully aware when we're building tech-oriented solutions for children in poverty, to understand how we can engage them and look at the multidimensional nature of poverty. And I think when we're talking about the digital divide, we're also talking about digital poverty, and also about the poverty of opportunities and innovation. And I think this is something we can tap into and explore further.
Do you want to talk about
Thank you, Raluca. That was wonderful. And thank you, Rose, for having us on this panel. Just like Raluca said, the digital divide for me falls along different lines. Okay, so in my line of work, I've seen that it falls along geography. So we see very big divides between people in urban areas and rural areas in terms of technology, but also in terms of access to devices and even the quality of devices and the prices for us. So one of the things when I was working at Alliance for Affordable Internet is that we don't just look at the price of a device or the price of internet. We look at its relativity to your pocket. Because $10 for you might be okay, might be pocket change, but $10 means a lot to somebody in another country with very low incomes. So it's important to look at the income versus, compare the income to the cost of a device or internet. And that's why we came up with the affordability index for us to be able to measure. And if you're spending more than 2% of your average monthly income on 1 gigabit of data, then it's not affordable. That's what we came up with, which became the global standard. We also noticed that the divide falls along gender. So women are less likely to be able to own a phone in a lot of cultures. I think the latest data I looked at was about 7% less likely to own a phone and 17% likely to be on the mobile internet. This is the GSMA data 2022. So again, there is a need to look at the inequality on that level. But the divide goes further. If you look at rural women, the percentage is even much lower. So we need to look at the desegregation of the data along many lines. The divide also falls along age. Yeah. So you find out that more women men and women, older people tend to be less likely to be online or to be connected. And, sometimes very younger people, much, much younger as well, because of the different social culture places they find themselves. And then obviously income levels as well. So digital divide it's a very multifaceted approach that we look at in my line of work, and I'll share more about that as we go along.
Thank you. Anasuya, do you want anything to add to that?
I'm really happy that both Raluca and Eleanor brought up the fact that the digital divide is not just a digital divide. I think it's really important to think of inequities of all kinds, that we're no longer in a simple binary, if we ever were, between the offline and the online, the digital and the physical. And it's also, I think, important for me to say, as a Rhodes Scholar, and having just listened to Rumaan and Stephanie have that wonderful conversation about another South African white male, that...
It's American, no.
Now very American. That it's also not just a problem of the present, that this is a historical set of events that have brought us to a moment in the history of humanity where we are on the edge of an abyss. I think we just have to admit that we are on this edge, looking in, interlocking crises of many different kinds, of which the digital is one very critical one, and the fact that this is a consequence of colonial capitalism. I always put those words together because I don't think you can separate them. Capitalism comes from somewhere and was justified through a process of extraction of people's lives, bodies, blood, intelligence, and land, and resources of other kinds. And at the same time, I think it's important to look at these digital divides as being one more manifestation of those inequities. So just as both Raluca and Eleanor said, if you look just at where we are in every part of the stack of the internet, right? From infrastructure to content, so looking up. Infrastructure itself is incredibly hegemonic. So just, we think about the history of the internet as being defense from the United States, but let's look at it another way and say that means tax-funded and public infrastructure. At this point, the dinosaurs that Rumaan talked about now own 1/10 of all submarine cables. Most of digital infrastructure in the world is owned by 5 companies, right? 2 companies in the world own all of cloud storage, so Amazon and Microsoft. When you look at governance spaces, the last standards body for engineering protocols, the IETF, had 6 attendees in their last physical session out of over 1,000 from Africa. The last ICANN meeting, which is the standards body for domain names, assigned names and numbers, had, I think, 1/5 of them were women. So we're looking at enormous, multiple, intersecting divides and inequities from every aspect of what we call a digital infrastructure, what we call the internet, whether it's at the level of physical infrastructure, to the level of content, to the level of governance, to the level of who's at the heart of design and architecture. And I think it's important for us to recognize that those inequities don't happen in a vacuum, but come out of the interlocking systems and structures of power that we're all inhabiting and are both complicit in, but also responsible for. Because I think I want to move us away from the guilt narrative to, I think, what Kevin and Roman talked about, which is the responsibility of all of us and these structures.
That was great. Thank you so much. I actually want to think about what you were saying just now with this feeling of we're at an abyss, and something that Roman was talking about earlier was a little bit like it feels like we're at the end of something, the end of maybe a platform, but in a wider sense in terms of, thinking about financially, the climate, the world, it feels like the world's just in decline. And yet this concept of futures is so important. And, I really liked what you said earlier, Raluca, about how it's a tremendous privilege to be able to imagine futures, maybe also a tremendous responsibility. So how do you go about imagining futures and working towards them with this feeling perhaps of hopelessness or with the inequalities and the inequities that you've described, Anasuya?
First of all, I wanted to share with you that I like the plural, futures, which means that we have a diversity of scenarios for the complexity of the issues that are very challenging for us right now. And I fully agree. It seems hopeless. It seems like our entire world is collapsing on so many levels. At the same time, I'm doing this work with children from poor communities across the world because I see so much potential. And I think we have to open our eyes and look around us and see how we can tap into this potential. Because can we actually talk about futures if we don't work with these kids who are the future generation? And I think we can definitely build around it, but with the consciousness that it's not easy. The complexity of tackling multidimensional poverty and digital inequity is tremendous. And there's no easy fix to it. And I think this is one of the takeaways from my work in the last decade. We're expecting quick fixes for this kind of situations, but there's none. What I think it works indeed is building synergies and looking at how we can build together a puzzle of interventions that are addressing in a 360 degrees manner the realities on the ground. And that doesn't mean just coming in a very patronizing way towards this community and saying, I think these are the solutions, but actually building on the agency of these communities and engaging them in the process. And also looking at fundamental challenges such as functional literacy. Can we talk about digital equity and digital literacy without addressing the fundamental issue of functional literacy? For instance, in Romania, 40% of the children in Romania are facing functional illiteracy. So basically they can read, but they don't understand much of it. So this is a society-wide problem we're facing, but at the same time we have this opportunity that is very much connected to what technology can bring to the table. And I just wanted to share that we've brought recently in Romania a global solution, which is a mobile app for children from 2 to 10 years old. They can read with the parents. On a mobile app, considering that 93% of the Romanians never buy a book in a year, but you have 70 million users of internet in the country, even in the most remote places. So we're seeing the situation on the ground and the opportunity, and we marry them in an intervention that is, of course, long-term. It engages public, private stakeholders, and it's also very much expressing the context on the ground with addressing low connectivity and the issues that we see in the communities.
Do you want to talk about the idea of building features?
So for me, I have been working more with a lot of governments and private sector.
Right.
With governments, it's interesting. They get very excited about tech, social tech futures, but I don't think they really understand what it takes to do that, especially some of the policy interventions that they have to put in, and how it means that they have to look at things from the long term, not from a 4-year election cycle, and not from a short-termism approach where you're looking at how much money you can get, maybe from selling a very expensive spectrum, which is what you need to be able to power a number of these digital technologies. And so one of the things we've been doing very carefully is in first of all, producing research. And as Ramona said, research is very, very important. If you do not know the gaps that you have, how do you provide a solution to it? And one of the research that we did was was looking at the quality of internet access and also the devices that people use to connect to the internet and whether they have connectivity at all times. And we found out that in places where the people are supposed to have access, the quality of the access is so poor that they cannot even stream, for instance, have a Zoom meeting without having buffering and interruptions. And so we came up with a standard which we call meaningful connectivity, which is something that's now been taken up by the ITU and global bodies, which says that, look, for you to have meaningful connectivity, you should have at least a 4G type speed with a device which is entry-level smartphone, to be connected at all times and to be able to connect at any place. So if you have internet shutdowns, which is something that we're seeing across countries in Ethiopia and in Myanmar and Egypt, so many places, then you don't have meaningful connectivity. So people can say, well, we have some kind of connectivity, but it is not meaningful. And another thing we've also looked at is working very closely with coalitions in various countries. And for me, that has been a real learning curve, because when you go into a country, you bring together private sector, you bring together governments, we bring together academia, we bring together researchers in a setting which is safe, which we are convening, and which gives everybody the chance to look at what are the things that need to change and who needs to change them. And it's very interesting to hear governments telling us that we've never been in a room with these people, like with civil society people, the activists. I think they have a problem with activists because they really challenge them on a lot of things. But if we're discussing issues about what kind of technologies do we need, what kind of digital futures do we need to be able to have a conversation about what is realistic and what is not. And having that convening power has been very useful for us. So we're working on a project now in Bangladesh, which I'm actually transitioning out of my organization. So by next week, I should be moving on to something more exciting. And but the work in Bangladesh has been really revealing, because Bangladesh, you have about 1/8. First of all, is anybody from Bangladesh here? Nobody? I don't see anyone. Oh. No, okay. That's about 180 million people that you're looking at potentially, and we're helping them develop the broadband ICT, broadband plan, actually. And what we found out that in 2009, they had one, but there wasn't real gender targets. They didn't look at persons with disabilities. They didn't look at a lot of marginalized communities. Bangladesh is currently hosting a lot of the refugees from Myanmar, Rohingya. And so we were telling them, look, we needed to have conversations about what the future broadband policy would look like, but we need to speak to a lot of these people. And they found it really strange, because they're like, well, the first time we would just develop it, and then we send it, we just have 1 week of public consultations, and then we already know what the answers to the questions are, so we'll just fill them out. But in this case, we started a process of making sure we go to communities, having conversations with them. What does internet mean to you? What would a digital future look like? What are some of the things you need the internet for, so that we can feed that into the policy? And that has been a much longer process, but it's been a big battle to get there, to get people to unlearn that if you really want to, you think about digital futures, you need to involve people from the planning phase. And it shouldn't be tokenism, it should be one that you're really genuinely listening to them. And that for me has been a real learning curve as well.
Yeah. Anything about, yes, how do we plan for the future? How do we do it in the face of everything that's so terrible in the world?
You know, the Maoris have a wonderful saying, and the Pacifica people in general, you can only walk backwards into the future. So you have to look back at where we've come from in order to go into the future. And I love, again, both what Raluca and Eleanor said, which is that it's not one singular future. It's, as the Zapatistas say, many worlds. Where is the futures where many worlds fit together? And in order for that to happen, I think exactly as they both said, one of the things for us to recognize is that equity cannot be a nice to have. It is actually a must have. Justice, equity, and a sense of centering the marginalized, who, just as a reminder, are the majority of the world, needs to be front and center. It's not tokenism. It can be an ethical imperative for those of us who believe in ethics. If you don't believe in ethics, at least see it as a strategic imperative to survive, right? But we have to think about multiplicity and plurality and centering the marginalized in ways that are pragmatic but also revolutionary simultaneously. So pragmatic revolution or revolutionary pragmatism, choose what you like, but I think it's key for us to shift the ways we think about it as from being either a dangerous distraction, which I've heard people talk about it as, from being a, we'll come to it down the line, to a must have. And I'm thinking really, as an Indian, from across the border from Bangladesh, my family, one side of my family came from Bangladesh. Ambedkar, Dr. Ambedkar, Dalit icon and architect of the Indian Constitution, which is the longest written constitution in the world, by the way, had a very ongoing political battle with Gandhi, because his point was you cannot ask people to wait for the liberation of the Dalit Bahujan people, that is caste oppressed people, by saying political freedom must be first. You have to consider social and political freedom together. And Fannie Lou Hamer, who is this wonderful African-American activist, said, no one is free until we are all free. And so we have to look at the practice of bringing these pluralities together. And I'm going to give you a very pragmatic example of it, which is, at whose knowledge, one of the things we look at is the multilinguality of the internet. Because if you look at language as a proxy for knowledge, which I think, how many of you here speak more than one language? Excellent, this is a perfect sample size. For you to imagine how you inhabit the world in the different languages you speak. So in each language that you speak, you actually know, feel, and do differently. And so if you think of language as a proxy for knowledge of the different systems of knowing, the fact that the internet is primarily monolingual, from the point of view of not just what we get on the internet as content, but the sort of monoculturalism of Silicon Valley and the hyperlocalism of Silicon Valley that claims to be global, then we are actually designing digital infrastructures that completely ignore most of the world's experience. So we have over 7,000 spoken and signed languages in the world, and I'm really grateful to our BSL interpreters here today. But there are over 300 signed languages. How many of us knew that? Sign is not one language. So even to think about what it means when you bring an expert in sign, in one of the signed languages, to a conversation around digital infrastructure. What does it mean for issues like capture? And does capture have audio capture? How many of our websites even have audio capture when we talk about privacy, surveillance, and all these issues? What does it mean for just 500 languages, which are primarily Eurolingual languages, to be content on the internet, and the rest of the world, has to manage somehow to be speaking on the internet, and I'm using speaking in scare quotes, in either their second or third language. Most of us come onto the internet in either a colonial language or in a dominant language. Most users come on in either English or Mandarin Chinese.
Yeah.
Right? So just using even language as one example, one way of thinking about what does it mean when we're bringing a plurality of people together to design these digital presents, not just futures, I think is key. But I think with imagination, I just want to end there. I see it slightly differently from Raluca, which is it's true, it is a privilege, and I think it is part of our resilience infrastructure. All of us who have come out of different histories of oppression and also complicity in oppression, imagination has been at the core of joy and resilience. We wouldn't have survived without imagination as well, just as children do, I think. And I think you would very much agree with that, because children imagine in ways that allow them to cope with the reality around them. And so I think this is at the core of this question is, if the imaginations of those who brought us to the abyss are not enough, in fact, not just not enough, have brought us to the abyss, whose imaginations get us out of here? And I will posit to all of you that those imaginations are here, they're in our communities, they exist, those imaginations are already hard at work. The question is, are we centering them? Are we even seeing them? Are we actually putting them at the heart of leadership and design decisions?
That's fantastic, and actually a really nice, beginning perhaps to our Q&A, which we now have. I think, if there's any questions from the room, we'll take them. Anyone have a question? Yes.
Hi, my name is Fadzai, and loved this panel as well as the previous one, because I think you said it really well, that we need to go beyond talking about digital divide, beyond also just geographies. I think if you talk to any historically targeted group, they can tell you about thinking about futures within lack of hope. And so with that in mind, I wondered if you had any advice for especially those of us in this room about what we should be engaging in and reading in, so we are basing our work in real life equity issues, and we're basing it in real frameworks that have often been written by queer people, by people of color. How do we bring that into our work so we're not stuck in a bubble that is removed from this?
You could say.
I can begin.
I
can begin, and I know that both Eleanor and Raluca will have many things to say. The way that I often start is, who do you not see in the room with you? And who looks least like you? Or what are the experiences that are most unlike your own? And even that process of self-reflexivity gets you to where do you need to go next? And I think it's particularly important for those who come from privileged backgrounds, and I count myself as one of those. I mean, I'm Savarna, which means I'm from a dominant caste in India. So for me, so much of knowledge justice, which is at the core of the work we do, knowledge meets tech justice, is about my own personal lifelong journey to be anti-caste and to center the experiences of Dalit Bahujan people who have been caste oppressed for much longer than colonialism. I mean, my people can show other people a thing or two about oppression. But what does it mean to look at a world in which, for instance, I am working in solidarity with Dalit Bahujan people, with disability rights activists, with trans activists, with people whose embodied experience and expertise is different from my own. And I think that is the key place. So we cannot, I want to say really clearly, representation is necessary but insufficient. And representation is never complete, because, you know, how far do you go? I mean, so much of the work we do now is almost like a diversity checklist, right? Like, do you have a black person? Do you have a woman? Oh my goodness, do you have a queer person? What if they're black, woman, and queer? Fantastic. 1 in 3, you know, or 3 in 1. And that form of checklist equity, I think, is no longer enough, because it actually doesn't design just socio-technical futures. It's just exactly as both Ruman and Stephanie were talking about, it's just a convenient camouflage for what decisions will already have been taken in the rooms where decisions are taken. So I think there's a piece around our own self-reflexivity and responsibility, and then there's a piece around, I think, the pragmatics of persuasion. So how, I'm a community organizer, I think about the pragmatics of persuasion as, depending on who you're trying to persuade, you start with the frames they have and get them to where you want them to go. So if, for instance, you're talking to a white tech bro, right, I can't start with an ethical framework if they don't understand ethics. I then start with a pragmatic framework around what they think markets are, what they think single points of failure of markets are, what might happen if you're actually designing, for instance, a car with a crash dummy that isn't a 6-foot-tall man. You would actually have fewer deaths. Women are 17% more likely to die in a motor accident and over 60% more likely to be seriously injured than men, simply because crash test dummies are built on a 6-foot-tall male figure, right? So designing differently has strategic implications. So how do we speak these, in this case, different multimodal, multilingual, in multilingual ways, so that we get to persuasion for what we see as an ethical and just set of futures?
I think I would just like to add that, especially the point of persuasion. We've been talking, in my line of work, we've been talking about why it's important to include more women in decision making, having more women in designing and being online. And we realized that we were not really getting the attention of a lot of policymakers in private sector. And so we, went back to the drawing board. What is the pain point for them? What would they like to see? We noticed that the things around finances, economic, the bottom line was something that they would resonate with them. So we did a research, which we called the cost of excluding women from the digital economy. And boy, that really blew up, because we were able to show that in the last 10 years, we took 36 low and middle income countries, $1 trillion has been lost just by excluding women from the digital economy over the last decade. Once we did that research, we were able to also show that in the next 5 years, if we can include more women in the online space, from creating, from decision making, from just working within the digital economy, we could unlock about $524 billion in the next 5 years within the same countries. So once we were able to show that, and it was a good starting point for a number of countries, because suddenly they hadn't realized that there was an economic benefit for having more women participating in the digital economy. They were looking at it more from it's an ethical issue, it's a social issue, but we just showed them that it was important not to look at it just from that point. There was an economic benefit, and that you can't just win a battle, you can't win a match by benching half of your top 10 stars, you needed to include them not just in the at the end of the life cycle. You needed to include them in the decision making, in the creativity, and in many other ways. So I think in terms of the persuasion, it's also finding out what the starting points could be and what research you can use to back it up to be able to help you to make a very emphatic point.
Yeah. And this is the kind of question you're supposed to ask yourselves every single day. It's not as if you ask yourselves once, you make a group of people who are diverse, you consult them, and that's it. Yeah. You extract what is necessary for your product, for the design you have in mind. This is something, I think it's more of a process than just a one-time experience. And what I can share beyond what Anasuya and Eleanor said already is that also when it comes to children and teenagers, it's fundamental to look at EdTech solutions from their perspectives as well. Yeah. And it's not easy because, of course, you have child safeguarding you have to consider, and security and a safe climate. So there are many issues that you need to take into consideration. But having them in the dialogue, I think it's important. And many times we forget about children because we consider that their voices are not relevant, are not strong enough. But since we're talking about the future, we need to consider their perspectives because they will shape the world we will live in. So this is what we're doing at UiPath Foundation as well. We're now building this digital platform, e-learning platform for teenagers from half of Romania, basically, from poor communities. And talking to them all the time to understand what's relevant to them, that really shapes the way this digital platform will respond to their educational needs. And I think this is a process. It's something we're doing constantly, and I don't think there's one answer to this question, but it's more how you address it every single day by creating safe, open spaces where to consult everyone about what you're building. Because otherwise we'll just shift into this tech chauvinism that entails tech has a solution for everything, and sometimes it doesn't, and we also have to accept this.
Exactly.
And just to build those solutions that make the most sense in the realities we are trying to tackle.
Absolutely. Thank you. I think we might have time for one more question because I know we're moving into a break, so I'll let the people on the floor decide for me.
Nicely done, Naina.
Yeah.
I probably got that because Dira's a friend. Hi, I'm Karan and I'm a criminal lawyer. So this is a very interesting audience for me. My research looks at the intersection of penal governance and tech from decarceral and emancipatory perspectives, looking at how tech futures can be built in penal governance from decarceral and emancipatory perspectives. So one problem that I face, and that's my question to you also, is when we approach communities, and I mean, obviously approaching and construction is very extractive. It's an inherently exploitative process. One problem that I recognize, especially in diverse communities that I work with, like let's say Global South, let's say India, is they are not coherent and consolidated communities. They are very fractured from within themselves and their relationship with outer community infrastructures like tech or policing or state or state protection. How do you then negotiate fractured communities? Thank you.
Maybe the right speak to that, Eleanor.
Wow, that's a very good question, by the way. One of the things that we've seen is, the first thing I have to admit, it's not easy. We've had some really tense moments in some of the communities that we're working in, and I remember we're working on a project in Liberia, for instance. And if you know the story of Liberia, it's come out of war, and there've been a lot of factions, and it's a very complicated community of people, different communities. Now, one of the things that we found out from my experience is that you have to earn trust. First of all, when you go into these spaces trying to engage, you need to, you have to go in on the basis that you are coming to learn as well, and you are not coming to impose. And also you have to earn the trust by being there for a much longer time. I don't know how to explain this, but one of the things is not to just parachute in and, organize a couple of people together, tea, coffee, whatever, and then, just give them, breakout sessions and do all that. They find it extractive, and some of them really, really detest that. So the thing is to make some time, understand people's culture, sit with them, different community leaders, also speaking to people who are might not be leaders, but then are very influential, those who don't speak much. And so being able to identify the various key stakeholders within a period and being able to engage them and earn that trust, I think you get a lot more out of them than to bring them together. There were some communities that don't see eye to eye, so it didn't make sense to put them together because the tensions were so much that you wouldn't get much out of that. And, so it's important to be able to have different ways of engaging different people, but always going in humility and always reminding them that the process is one that they are leading, you are guiding them based on your expertise, and that trust is something that you have to sustain throughout the process. I don't know if that answered your question, but that's the experience I've had from a war-torn country.
Yeah, and I also worked many years as a community organizer in very fractured communities, worked extensively with a Roma community, which is one of the most discriminated minority across Europe. And even this, as you probably know, they came more than 1,000 years ago from India, so there are a lot of connections, and I explored with Anasuya these connections and how the rejection in India was somehow moved in Europe, and you see a very similar type of attitudes in terms of exclusion when it comes to this group. And usually it is perceived as a monolith. So when people want to, and different entities want to organize activities in these communities, they don't look at the dynamics there and the fracture within this community. So there's a lot of diversity, there are a lot of opposing traditions, approaches, even within this kind of community. And I think one takeaway is never look at a community as being a monolith, just being very grounded in the realities and the dynamics. Secondly, I think it's also a very tough practice of patience. Just as Eleanor was saying, you just don't parachute yourself in the middle of community, organize consultation, and that's it. Tap into those platforms that are already in those communities. Find those organizations who have this very strong bond of trust with the community and work with them by designing a plan that also engages the community, and be very transparent to them why you're doing this, what's your intention, have a lot of clarity, because you'll see that in such communities, trust has been broken so many times that just coming from outside, maybe with a solution that could work very well there, will be instantly rejected if you don't work with these platforms that are already there for a long time. So look at long-term community organizing initiatives or something similar to it, and build on the existing trust with a lot of transparency.
So much wisdom from Raluca. And
Yeah, maybe
Eleanor.
a final point before we let everyone.
Yeah, I think trust, humility, recognizing that communities are not homogeneous. And I think, again, to reframe, sometimes it's just like sort of a little neck wrench in your head, right? Which is to think of difference not as something to be feared, but as something to actually be cherished and celebrated. So communities are not monoliths. There's going to be conflict and dissent, but if you construct these long-term engagements of trust that are around recognizing difference and working with it, then especially in the tech world, which is primarily a world that works in homophily, that is, most people look like each other and think like each other and talk like each other, I think we get to futures that are much more just, as Audre Lorde would say, because difference, I think, is at the core of humanity. So it's something to be celebrated rather than feared.
Thank you. I think that's a great note with which to end. So thank you so much, Raluca, Anasuya, Eleanor, for your time. I have been asked to tell you something, which I am now bringing up on my phone, which is just where to go after this. So I understand that you have about a 10-minute break, and after that, you'll be going to the next session. AI is in the Hazlitt room, biotech in the Flowers, and the Network Society is right here. But please have some coffee and tea in the meantime, and see you later.
May I say one thing before we go, which is that I just want to thank Naina for stepping in last minute to be the moderator. And I want to acknowledge Masa, who was meant to be our moderator, but is in the heart of the Iranian Revolution right now. And our hearts and our solidarity go out to her.
Absolutely.
And all the extraordinary women, girls and men who are at the heart of that.
Thank you so much.